Hello, and welcome back to Inside Update, a show brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org, a nonprofit newsroom where we create investigative journalism to root out corruption in the state of Connecticut. My name's Connor Dragotis. I'm the managing editor here, and today I am joined by Catherine Revelo, who is going to talk to us a little bit about secession. The possibility, as long shot as it may be, of Connecticut becoming a new Canadian province. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the Labor Committee as Connecticut's legislative session gets underway, and two striking worker bills that have come up, and they've been voted to be advanced. So look out for that one as well. Catherine, first and foremost, how are you doing today?
It is almost a long weekend, Connor, and session started. We're busy, so I think we're doing good, but waiting for that long weekend to kick in.
Yeah, we are. I'm out of the office next week, so we're recording this a week early on Thursday the 16th. I don't think this will come out until next Friday, but we wanted to make sure we had an episode in the can, and also we definitely didn't want to let something as spicy and interesting as this secession investigation kind of get mixed up in the week cycle. Let's start with this investigation. So the title is, could Connecticut become a new Canadian province? And frankly, I guess what happened here? Connecticut got an invitation. So let's use that as a jumping off point. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, so, right, obviously, you know, we try to steer away from some of this controversial stuff and just do, straight news here. But, we have to acknowledge, I think, that, this was a response to Donald Trump winning the election, which obviously people have very strong feelings for and against him. And so this was a New York State senator who, I think, out of frustration with the outcome of the recent election results, basically said that New York should leave the US and should join Canada, and invited Connecticut and I believe Massachusetts to do so as well. And so we were kind of talking about it in the newsroom, and what does an invitation like that, if we're going to take it seriously, actually look like? What are the steps that Connecticut would take to secede? Does Connecticut even have the ability to secede constitutionally?
Yeah, you're really hitting on something so important, which is obviously we are mission limited to Connecticut. That's where we investigate corruption. That's where we ask questions. That's part of our designation as a C3. And again, that mission is we need to keep it narrow. But when something like this comes along, it is kind of a universal question. And as I was thinking about this episode today, and that knowing that we were going to be talking about it, I was looking into some of the data, and it turns out, in the last 571 years, there are 465 nations that have ceased to exist. And that comes from an article by B.J. Campbell called "The Surprisingly Solid Mathematical Case for the Tinfoil Hat Gun Prepper," which is a kind of a famous article now from back in 2018. But basically, it makes the argument that change is inevitable, right? I don't think any of us can sit here and say that Connecticut or the United States is likely going to be there in 30 million years. The timeline is likely shorter, but what does that mean when change is happening? And you were able to talk to people who are not only acknowledging the reality of change, but they seem to be taking active steps to do it peacefully and protect the interests of their communities. What was that like?
Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. So we talked to the New England, I believe, Independence Coalition. Let me make sure I'm getting that right. Independence Coalition or Campaign, um, which is a group that's Independence Campaign, there we go. They basically want New England to become their own country and to effectively secede from the rest of the United States. And, they have, I think a lot of times you hear something like that and think it's, wackadoo tinfoil hat preppers in their basements. And sometimes it is, but there are also really interesting political questions about this kind of stuff. And people can have very thoughtful conversations about that, which is what we had, because their list of grievances are things that are real. One of the things they pointed out is if you live in many of the states in New England and in the Northeast, the amount of money that these states send to the federal government is less than what we get back from the federal government. So, does that really is that a benefit to states like Connecticut to be part of the US when monetarily they're not getting anything out of it?
Connecticut's
And
bottom of the barrel there, right? Sorry to interrupt, but just to
yeah,
clarify that number, Connecticut is 48th, 49th, 50th in terms of actual returns from federal money.
yeah, yes, it is, and it's been down there for a while. All that is we go in depth into the article, and that if you want more on it. So that's a pretty, you can say, whether or not you believe that means that the U.S. should secede or not is a question, but that is a real issue. And one of their other big arguments, which is also something that's a really fascinating First Amendment case, is you as a U.S. taxpayer through the state are sending money to the federal government, and that federal government is being used for programs in, other states that maybe don't have the same values that you do. And I mean, that's something that we've seen a lot of politicians in Connecticut sort of allude to already, the fact that Donald Trump is coming into office next Monday. And his stated policies are pretty much at odds with a lot of the stated policies of Democrats in Connecticut. And we've seen, William Tong has alluded a couple of times to trying to do everything that we can at the state level or that he can, I should say, at the state level to kind of resist the changes that Donald Trump wants to make. Lamont alluded to it in his State of the State and kind of the uncertainty in terms of budget and what that means. So that's things that, state level politicians are kind of recognizing the fact that, there is this kind of philosophical difference at times between what politicians at the federal level or politicians at different state wants, and that there are different political cultures in states. And that's, one of the points that the NEIC, is making and is arguing for. New England has a regionally distinct culture, political attitudes, and that doesn't necessarily line up with things that the federal government is funding in other parts of the country. So again, does that really benefit New England at that point to be part of the United States? Those are the kind of questions that they're asking.
Yeah. And I mean, Tong and others, I mean, this was another book I was flipping through this morning, but they're practicing civil disobedience. Like that is a way that, the state is exercising their sovereign power to push back against, I believe what they would say is probably a community of consent of that is Connecticut against outside force.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. It kind of reminds me of this is the whole United States in its basis, right? Necessity of one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another. At some point, that's a cycle. It comes back. And what's interesting, I think, in your conversation with that group is that it's one of more than 20 secession movements that are active in the United States right now. But it also points to the fact that coalition building is so hard because the complaints or frustrations are so vastly different, right? If you're frustrated with Donald Trump's policies or the way that your money is being spent, I believe you talked about in Alabama in the investigation versus, we also see overseas money or local spending, or heck, we see this on a microcosm just in our towns. So the more people, it just gets more and more complicated. Did that make it difficult to write? I mean, let's just talk about it from a reporter trying to put out quality story perspective. Did that make it challenging?
I mean, I think it is a little challenging to write because so much of this is, I mean, a lot of it is opinion, but a lot of it is also very theoretical stuff. And I mean, you know this, Connor, because we've had multiple discussions about it. But, I have a political science degree. I love political theory. I can talk about this stuff all day. But, when you're looking for a news story from me, you're not looking for, a 10,000 word treatise on, big political thoughts. So, it is a little difficult to write in that sense and to be like, okay, I know I care about this from a philosophical and theoretic perspective because I just think it's fascinating. But, why should other people care about this? Right? I think is the question that you have to go back to with news stories and those elements of newsworthiness. And obviously, we have that news hook about the invitation for Connecticut to secede, but and that's also where we tried to weave some of that data in about, monetarily what Connecticut sends to the federal government versus what we got back. We talked about the Hartford Convention, which was one of those secession movements that happened back in the 1800s, having to deal with Federalist versus anti-Federalist politics. We talked about a couple of secession movements that have happened. I believe it was in Vermont, where one of the ski towns wanted to secede.
Recently, very recently.
Yeah, very recently. And from our research, basically only didn't happen just because there was a lack of coordination among the different parties that were involved. So interesting question of like legally, I don't know what their standing is because it didn't get that far because it just, typical New England politics. I think we're not always the most organized people in the world because we're too busy arguing with each other. Um, but yeah, so to answer your question, right? I mean, I think it is to try to come back and ground that into why should people care about this, which I think is part of our mission as journalism for humans by humans. That is the thing that I tried to remember while I was writing this.
Yeah. And I'll actually say, I got another text. It just occurred to me as you said about the recent movements. There have been new movements since we put out this investigation happening in Indiana seeking to absorb Illinois counties. So this is a constant discussion that's happening within and external to the country. From an editing perspective, I agree with what you're saying about the difficulty of keeping it narrow and making sure that we're serving our audience. I think this is the case with every single article we write, where you can very quickly deviate into political and moral philosophy, which is probably value added, but this isn't the place for it. And that is one of the most important things. Obviously, in this show, we're trying to also pull back the curtain on how we do our jobs. Is we have to check each other.
Yes.
And I think our team does a really good job about that when we're reading through drafts or we're having conversations as we're mapping out different tips is, hey, we could go this direction. And there's almost always someone who's saying, how does this tie back to our mission? How does this tie back to being a good journalist in service to the people of Connecticut? And I really love that about you guys, because if we don't have that, that's how you slip into advocacy. And that's the death knell of good journalism, is if you're just putting out stuff that says, oh, here's what I believe, take it or leave it. That's not to say, though, that this piece was not without, I think, some frustrations or disappointments. And I know from an editor's perspective, I was very disappointed that there was no response from Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, Green Party, I believe, was the fourth that you reached out to, or was it Working Families? I know you said in the article there were four, but long story short, no one got back to you to talk about, hey, how does this impact, what does this actually mean in practice? What is the political process in Connecticut? Is this a real question? Or are we just it seems instead that there was mostly just a blind eye, or I don't know, maybe everyone was just wanting to hang out over Christmas and not have a real conversation. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I mean, right, and obviously to answer that question, I'm going to give what is my opinion here, but I think a lot of it is concern about going on the record with statements where we're talking about that sort of thing. Right. And we had reached out to all of the different caucus leaders to, kind of get their response to like, hey, if we're gonna take this as a serious invitation, who responds to this? Whose job is it to respond to this? Like how should it be handled? How should, politicians think about stuff like this? Which I think would have been a really great perspective to add to the story and to get, the viewpoints of different parties, which obviously have different goals and different reactions to the incoming administration. And unfortunately, we, either just didn't get a response or weren't able to, get an interview set up with any of those caucuses, to ask those questions. So unfortunately, when you don't get a response, the only thing we can actually put in the story is that we didn't get that response. So, that's a piece that I think would have been really informative and would have helped with that element of why should people care about that, ended up not being something that we could include.
Yeah. I've also heard leaders of these various parties talk with, you know, great eloquence about the underlying rights that this questions. And I thought that when we were initially talking about it, one of my hopes had been, let's have a conversation and understand how you interpret, your job to your constituents, for example, and the role that they're supposed to play. And to get nothing was a letdown. And I'm not going to prognosticate on, you know, I guess the broader picture of what that is indicative of, but it's frustrating from a journalistic perspective, if nothing else, because I mean that's part of our job is to try to deliver information and unique perspectives, and we want to inform and educate. But we're also limited, as you said, we're not going to insert our opinions into these investigations, so we're ultimately left with what people are willing to talk to us about. Um, Not to offer too tortured a transition on the topic of rights here, but I want to make sure that we leave time to talk about the two striking worker bills. Anything else on secession? Otherwise, you want to tell us what happened on January 14th?
Yeah, so these are right, this is returning from last session when it was pretty controversial and right, there's two bills coming out of the Labor Committee, and at this point, one of them is just a concept that they voted to advance it to flesh out, and the other was an actual bill that they voted to draft language for that would allow workers who go on strike to apply for and receive unemployment insurance. Which is something that last session there was a bill that got kind of pushed through at the last minute. Obviously, Republicans were opposed to it. They thought it was kind of a sneaky bill because there wasn't any actual language in it about that. It was about creating a non-lapsing fund in the comptroller's office. Lamont didn't like it. He said it at a press conference that he didn't like it, and he ended up vetoing the bill, which is now back in two different forms. You have Democrats who are advancing it kind of on the grounds that, they believe it's a workers' rights issue and, effectively saying that, this is necessary for workers because, if you go on strike, you're not earning a paycheck, and that kind of gives management an upper hand to do things like effectively starve you out and get you to capitulate. So that's sort of the Democratic view. And then the Republican response to it has been that, it's not a workers' rights issue. They're viewing it as Democrats kind of trying to tip the scales towards laborers against management and sort of inserting themselves into what they think is purely a private dispute.
Yeah, just to use the actual quotes that you have in the article too. Republicans said it was trickery, and Lamont called it, quote, too cute by half last year, which I thought was a nice turn of phrase. I think it accomplished everything it needed to with not too many words. This is also interesting, despite not being able to provide comments on the secession question, there's been no shortage of ink spilled over these issues. Generally, I think this is really raising people's hackles. Legislators are fired up about it. There's obviously a huge pressure behind this as well from those who would benefit. I don't know if you have anything to share about that, but I just feel like we should acknowledge that this isn't happening in a bubble. This isn't just a state house question. This is across the state. People feel very strongly about this one.
Right. Yeah. I just want to add to that. This is a legislative priority for Democrats this session too. That was part of the discussion that happened during the Labor Committee meeting. So, obviously it's far from a bipartisan issue. It's, basically the opposite of it. By the numbers, Democrats, it's definitely going to advance out of committee. So, we'll kind of see what happens to it. And part of the conversation to the question you just asked, Connor, kind of alluded to the fact that because the one of the two bills that was advanced, the striking workers aspect of it is one portion, the other portion of it is a would affect quotas at warehouses that workers are required to abide by, which, is basically about Amazon. Was kind of was danced around a little bit during that committee meeting. So obviously, in that it's about Amazon, clearly that is a big labor issue across the country where you've got strikes going on out on the West Coast and attempts to unionize and all that sort of thing.
It's kind of a battle sometimes to keep our scope just in Connecticut, right? I mean, Connecticut's such an interesting place, both because of the way that ideas tend to come into Connecticut from the national sphere, and then also from Connecticut emerge into the national sphere. We work very hard to make sure that what we produce is localized and useful to people who live in Connecticut. But credit to your mindset, Catherine, and managing to make sure that you're keeping these topics useful and timely and relevant to the local focus that we are dedicated to. We're coming down to the last couple minutes here. I know you are constantly on the lookout for tips. You've been doing some amazing transparency work, including continuing to put out transparency update. Anything else that you want to share with our readers, watchers, listeners here?
Um, I don't know that there's too much, right? Obviously, FOIA is my big issue. We're watching it closely this session. There's already one bill that would exempt single family homes, their floor plans from Freedom of Information requests, which is an interesting bill because we did an investigation last year on how personal information can be found through the Freedom of Information Act. But it would be a huge change if it goes through because, right now, if you want building plans for something, a lot of times you can go to your town website and look it up online, or you just go down to the town hall. So, right now this bill's just a concept, so there's no language to it, so we don't know what it would be. But I think that'll be an interesting one to watch because that has the potential to change not only what is FOIA-able, but what public information is just out there and available at the municipal level.
Absolutely. Yeah, no doubt about it. We will be continuing to chase down transparency topics in 2025, and I don't necessarily see that ever stopping unless somehow transparency just becomes 100% of the time and we find ourselves looking for another way to root out corruption. Catherine, thank you. Such great stuff, really cool topics. I'm not going to tease your next investigation, but you have got some really cool stuff in the pipeline that we're going to keep under wraps for the minute. I'm just gonna tell everyone to go subscribe. Go give us your email so it'll appear right in your inbox, everything that Catherine writes. I'll also point out we're a nonprofit. This is how we survive as a business, is through the generosity of our readers, watchers, and listeners. 100% of our funding is voluntarily given by those who believe in our mission to root out corruption in Connecticut through investigative journalism. And of course, you can do that on our website. But I'm also going to mention here, because we have seen an uptick in alternate kinds of donations, you can give through donor advised funds, wills or bequests, charitable gift annuities, charitable trusts. You can give from your IRA. We take crypto. You can make a property donation. There are so many ways to help us support our bottom line. And of course, the most important thing you can do is help us grow our subscriber list, make sure that your email is included, and then also make sure that you are sharing our stories far and wide. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We'll be back in 2 weeks. And until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.